I thought I was alone at a quiet bus stop late at night, carrying the weight of a long day and even longer years. Then I looked up and saw a familiar face I never expected to see there, filled with worry. What happened next changed how I saw myself, my family, and the meaning of being truly seen. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Are you listening from a small town, a big city, or somewhere in between? Let me know in the comments. And if stories like this speak to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It helps us keep sharing thoughtful stories that stay with you long after they end. Now let me tell you what happened. I still remember the hum of the streetlights that night, the way they flickered like they were as tired as I was. The bus stop sat at the edge of Main Street, a simple metal bench and a glass shelter smudged with fingerprints and old flyers. It was late, later than I usually stayed out, but sometimes life doesn't ask what's convenient. It just keeps moving, and you move with it or get left behind. I had my coat pulled tight around me, the air sharp with the promise of colder days ahead. The road was mostly empty, just the occasional car rushing past, its headlights briefly illuminating my reflection in the glass. A woman in her 50s, lines earned honestly, eyes that had seen more than they used to admit. I was heading home after helping a friend who needed me, the kind of help you don't think twice about until your body reminds you that you're not 40 anymore. I was lost in my thoughts when I sensed someone standing nearby. You know that feeling when the air shifts and you're suddenly aware you're not alone. I looked up, a little startled, and that's when I saw him. My nephew. For a second, I thought my tired mind was playing tricks on me. He stood a few steps away, hands in his jacket pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched. The light caught his face just enough for me to see the worry there, plain and unguarded. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this part of town, especially not at this hour. I said his name, my voice sounding smaller than I expected in the open night. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a long time. "Auntie, I've been looking for you," he said. There was relief in his voice, but also something else. Concern, the kind that settles deep and doesn't leave. I asked him what on earth he was doing there, and he shrugged in that familiar way that reminded me of him as a boy, trying to act braver than he felt. He told me he'd driven by earlier, seen me sitting there alone, and circled back because it didn't feel right to just leave me. That hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent years being the one who showed up, who checked in, who made sure everyone else was okay. Standing there under those buzzing lights, realizing someone had done the same for me, stirred something quiet and powerful in my chest. We sat down on the bench, a respectful distance between us, the glass shelter creaking slightly as a breeze passed through. He asked where I was coming from, if I was tired, if I was warm enough. Simple questions, but they carried weight. I answered honestly, admitting I was worn out in more ways than one. The night seemed to listen as we talked. I told him about the small moments that had been piling up lately, the ones you brush aside until they start to feel heavy. He listened without interrupting, nodding now and then, his eyes steady on mine. There was no judgment there, no impatience, just presence. At one point, a bus roared past without stopping, sending a gust of wind and noise around us. When it was gone, the silence felt deeper. I realized how rare it was, this kind of conversation, where you don't feel rushed or overlooked, where being heard is enough. He told me he worried about me sometimes, that I carried more than I let on. Hearing that from him, from someone who had once held my hand to cross the street, made me see our relationship differently. Not changed in a way that crossed lines, but deepened, matured into something rooted in mutual respect. As we waited for the next bus, I felt a quiet shift inside me. I wasn't just the caretaker or the background support anymore. I was a woman allowed to be tired, allowed to be seen, allowed to accept care without feeling weak. When the bus finally appeared in the distance, its lights cutting through the dark, I knew this night would stay with me. Not because of anything dramatic, but because of the simple truth it revealed. Even late at night, even at an empty bus stop, connection can find you when you least expect it. The bus doors folded open with a tired sigh, and we stood up together. I stepped aside to let him go first, an old habit I hadn't realized I still carried. Inside, the bus smelled faintly of rubber and disinfectant, the kind of scent that always reminded me of long rides and longer thoughts. There were only a handful of passengers scattered through the seats, each wrapped in their own quiet world. We sat across from each other, the vinyl seats cool even through my coat. As the bus pulled away, the city slid past the windows in blurred streaks of light. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the pause you take before saying something that matters. He broke the silence by asking how long I'd been feeling so worn down. I considered giving him the easy answer, the one that brushed it off as just a busy week. Instead, I surprised myself by telling the truth. I talked about the slow accumulation of responsibilities, about how life after a certain age seems to speed up while your energy quietly slows. I told him how sometimes I felt invisible, not ignored exactly, just expected to keep going without question. He listened the same way he had at the bus stop, with his full attention. The hum of the engine filled the space between my words, steady and grounding. When I finished, he nodded thoughtfully and said something simple but profound, that he admired how I kept showing up, even when it was hard, and that it was okay to let others take a turn sometimes. Those words settled into me like a warm cup of tea on a cold night. I realized how rarely anyone acknowledged that part of me. We talked about his life too, about the pressures he felt trying to balance work, expectations, and his own hopes. Hearing him speak so openly reminded me that worry doesn't belong to one generation. It just changes its shape. As the bus rolled on, I found myself noticing small details I usually overlooked. The soft rattle of loose change in a passenger's pocket, the glow of storefronts closing for the night, the way my nephew sat forward when he spoke, earnest and careful. There was a sense of equality in our conversation that felt new and meaningful. When my stop approached, he stood with me, insisting on walking me the rest of the way home. The night air felt calmer now, less sharp. Our footsteps echoed lightly on the sidewalk as we talked about family memories, shared laughter over small stories from years ago. Those memories seemed to bridge the distance between who we were then and who we had become. At my door, I turned to thank him. The words felt inadequate for what the evening had given me, but they were sincere. He smiled, that familiar smile that carried both the boy I remembered and the man he had grown into. He told me to call him any time, no matter the hour. After he left, I stood for a moment before going inside, listening to the quiet of the neighborhood. I felt lighter somehow, not because my problems had vanished, but because they no longer felt like mine alone. That night, I slept with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long while, knowing that connection, when it's rooted in care and respect, has a way of finding you exactly when you need it most. The days after that night unfolded more slowly than usual, as if time itself had decided to give me a little room to breathe. I noticed it in small ways at first. I woke up without the familiar knot in my chest. My coffee tasted richer. Even the morning light through the kitchen window seemed gentler. Nothing in my life had dramatically changed, and yet everything felt slightly more balanced. I found myself thinking about that bus stop more than I expected, not the cold or the empty street, but the feeling of being seen without having to explain myself. It stirred memories from earlier years, times when I had felt strong and certain, before responsibilities layered themselves so thickly that I forgot to check in with my own heart. A few days later, my nephew called me in the evening. His voice was easy, not urgent like it had been that night, but warm and familiar. He asked how I was doing, really doing, and I told him the truth again, that I was better, that I'd been thinking, that something had shifted. We talked about ordinary things at first. Work frustrations, a neighbor of his who played music too loudly, a recipe he was trying to perfect. But beneath it all ran a deeper current. There was an unspoken understanding that our conversation mattered, that we were both choosing to be present rather than distracted. I told him I'd started taking short walks again, just around my neighborhood, leaving my phone at home. I described the sound of leaves under my shoes and the way the air smelled like damp earth. He said that sounded peaceful, and I could hear a smile in his voice. He encouraged me to keep doing things just for myself, not because anyone needed me to, but because I deserved it. That word stayed with me. Deserved. It wasn't one I often applied to myself. A week later, we met for lunch at a small diner halfway between our homes, the kind of place with cracked leather booths and a chalkboard menu that changed daily. Sitting across from him in the daylight felt different from that night, but no less meaningful. I could see how much he'd grown, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself, thoughtful and steady. We talked about family, about the roles we fall into without realizing it. I admitted that I'd spent much of my life being the reliable one, the quiet support in the background. He told me that role had mattered more than I knew, that it had shaped how he learned to care for others. Hearing that filled a space inside me I hadn't known was empty. As we ate, I became aware of how comfortable I felt. There was no need to impress or perform. Just two people sharing a meal and an honest connection. I realized then that personal discovery doesn't always come from dramatic moments. Sometimes it comes from sitting still long enough to recognize your own worth reflected in someone else's eyes. When we parted ways that afternoon, I felt a renewed sense of direction. Not a plan exactly, but an openness. I was learning to accept support without guilt, to speak when something felt heavy, and to honor the quieter seasons of life instead of resisting them. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror again. The lines were still there, the years still visible. But this time, I didn't look away. I saw a woman still growing, still learning, still capable of connection and change. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like more than enough. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of my life began to settle into a new pattern, one that included more awareness of myself and the people around me. I realized that the night at the bus stop wasn't a one-time event. It had planted a seed, a reminder that even when life feels heavy, the bonds we share with others can bring light into unexpected moments. One chilly evening, I found myself walking to the corner store, carrying a small grocery bag and humming quietly to myself. The street was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes your own thoughts feel louder. I paused at the crosswalk, waiting for the light, when I noticed my nephew walking toward me. He waved, his breath visible in the cold air, and I felt that familiar warmth spread through me. We walked together, side by side, and the conversation flowed easily. There was no need for pretense, no pressure to be someone I wasn't. We spoke about small victories and setbacks, shared memories, and even silly jokes that made us both laugh. Yet beneath the casual tone was a subtle, steady understanding. We were both taking care of each other in ways that went deeper than words. When we reached my doorstep, I invited him in for a cup of tea. The kitchen smelled of warm spices and old wood. We sat at the small table by the window, watching the snow begin to fall in delicate flakes. I shared stories of my younger years, moments I had kept tucked away, unsure who would care to hear them. He listened, attentive and thoughtful, and I realized how much our connection had grown. He shared his own reflections too. He admitted that seeing me at the bus stop had stayed with him, that it reminded him how easily life could rush by without noticing the people who matter most. He spoke of gratitude and concern, but also of trust, the kind that forms when you know someone truly sees you, flaws and all, and chooses to stay. There was a moment of silence after that, comfortable and grounding. I thought about the nights when I had felt alone, the days when the weight of responsibility seemed endless, and I realized how much lighter life felt with someone willing to share that burden. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic interventions. It was about presence, attention, and mutual respect. As he left that night, I lingered by the door, watching him walk away. My heart felt both full and calm. I understood now that the most unexpected experiences, like finding someone waiting for you at a bus stop in the middle of the night, could become turning points. They reminded you of your own strength and the depth of connection that exists when you allow yourself to be seen. I closed the door gently and leaned against it for a moment, reflecting on the journey I'd been through in just a few short weeks. There was growth, yes, but also gratitude, a gratitude for small acts of care, for open conversations, and for the people who remind us of our worth without demanding anything in return. That night, I went to bed with a sense of quiet contentment, carrying the memory of those moments like a small, steady flame. Life continued as it always does, but I was no longer simply moving through it. I was present, aware, and open to the unexpected ways love and concern show up, even at a cold bus stop late at night. And for that, I was deeply, quietly thankful.